good morning, everybody. It's late morning, almost noon. We're running a little bit early, but hopefully that's all right. I'm here for a quick interview, which I scheduled today because today is a holiday that's kind of in transition. It's been Columbus Day for quite some time. And more recently, there have been campaigns to call it Indigenous Persons Day to try to reckon with or be honest about some of the history, some of it not so pretty, about the colonization of this land. A lot of it not so pretty. But I also was once told by a seminary professor that when you get to a new church, you should research that church's history and not just stop with the history of the church, but go back and learn the history of the land that it's on. And so that's been part of my quest here. And the person that God sent me to help me with that quest is a member of Grace Church, Denny Dubois, and he's with me here, having done a lot of good research on Indigenous persons and Indigenous peoples and First Peoples, and as well as a lot of other history. But he's a wealth of knowledge and has helped me find some good information. So Denny, would you introduce yourself and tell us about what your interest in the history and religion of Indigenous persons is, and how you got to be interested in it?
Sure. Well, I'm a retired Navy captain and defense contractor for about 40 years. Got into that profession sort of by chance. I was a graduate PhD candidate at Iowa State University in geology and earth science. And my teaching assistantship money ran out, and my major advisor said, go to the Navy, be a naval officer, learn photo interpretation. When you come back, you'll be ready to pick up where you left off. My master's field paper was entitled Geology, Flora, and Fauna of Miners Park in New Mexico. It was a picnic area in the woods for gold miners. And I got to thinking after I submitted the paper, why did they select that area? What was special about it? And were there other people, perhaps prior to the miners, that felt that way about that area or the surrounding area? When I got to Virginia in my Navy career, I like to hike and by myself out in the woods, and I got the idea of maybe replicating my graduate work in a geology, flora and fauna and people of Virginia's Piedmont. And once I got into the research, I realized it was just way too much, probably at least 2 books. And the result is that I'm fascinated by the relationship of the archaeology, geology, and there's much yet to be found, much yet to be learned, and much is being destroyed by construction. So it's important that we document and try to find as many of these old sites and pay attention to what we're looking at and trying to fit them into the puzzle of what has come before us in this whole area. And in part, our attitude today, I think, is because of this historical portrayal of America in 1492 as a vast, uninhabited wilderness, when in fact, the National Museum of the American Indian and others tell us that among North America, Central America, and South America, there were perhaps 53 million people living here when Columbus came to the shores. And yet the prevailing attitude of that colonial era was that the people were just a part of the resources, like timber and soil and water. They were manpower that was available free of charge to develop the land.
Thank you. Can you introduce us to some of those peoples? Maybe what have you learned about the folks who lived in kind of this part of the land before Europeans arrived?
Well, when you say this part of the land, are you talking Clover Hill specifically? I don't know of any in-depth archaeological digs at Clover Hill. Quite a lot about the Piedmont of Virginia and of North America. And probably if you were in a history class 20 years ago, you might not even recognize the early history of the U.S. Prior to European contact. I think it's pretty well established that the Vikings did discover land in the western part of the Atlantic, Greenland, Iceland, Nova Scotia. And in fact, there is a computer study of the Delaware Indian language that has suggested that some of that language is in fact Celtic or Viking.
Wow.
So we haven't found anything this far south that would relate to the Vikings, but maybe people that had contact with them have actually moved in. And then when we talk about archaeologically, the people in this area, you have to talk about the impact of the last ice age, how people have changed. So the last ice age started winding down about 13,000 years ago. And we all learned in high school that there was a Bering land bridge there, and there was Clovis points that were found in New Mexico that were about 13,000 years old. So the people must have come across the land bridge and were in New Mexico 13,000 years ago. But the problem with that is that there are also Clovis points in Fairfax that are 13,000 years old. And at 13,000, 12,000 years ago, that land bridge would have encompassed all of Alaska. And at the eastern end of it was an ice mass that was 2 miles thick. So they weren't going anyplace during that period of time. In addition to that, there's archaeology at Bull Run Mountain and Front Royal that is at least 13,000 years old. So there were people living here, hunting here in groups 13,000 years ago when others couldn't get across that land bridge from Siberia. As I mentioned, there's even a Clovis point found in Old Town Alexandria. There are numerous sites around Front Royal that fall into that 13,000-year-old category. There are even older sites in Virginia, Cactus Hill and Saltville. Cactus Hill is down near Petersburg, Saltville down near Danville. Those two sites are among the 9 oldest sites of confirmed human habitation in all of North America. 18,000 years old or older. They were probably just part or a legacy of people that were already here. Meadowcroft is 15,000 years old. That's in Pennsylvania. Topper in South Carolina is perhaps 50,000 years old. And kind of put these things in perspective, a 13,000-year-old site is 2,000 years older than when nomadic tribes came together to form the Egyptian dynasty. At 50,000 years old, the Topper site had been around 25,000 years before Abram left Ur to explore what is modern Syria and settle in Israel. The granddaddy of them all, which is turning people's head, is Cerruti in San Diego at over 130,000 years old. if that is in fact confirmed, it will change the entire thought process of how people got to North America and populated this land. And finally, a huge DNA study done by Harvard of Native people. The oldest DNA ever found in a human is a Blackfoot Indian, 17,000 years old, but the DNA is from Peru. So land bridge, long history of how the people got here. You know, what is the land? Who are these people, you asked? We talked a little bit about the Ice Age. I'm a little ahead of you here, Drew.
That's fine.
The Ice Age is just kind of glossed over, I think, in high school and college. Started 150,000 years ago, ended about 13,000 years ago. 40, and there are people today, scientists today, who say it's not over because there's still ice at the poles. But 40% of all the water on Earth was tied up in that glacial period. All of Canada was covered, all of the North Atlantic up into Scandinavia, as much as or greater than 2 miles thick. The closest it came to this area was central Pennsylvania. But what the impact it had on this area for people that were living here was that it was much colder, 25 degrees average temperatures colder than right now. Spruce forests instead of hardwood forests. So it would look like southern Canada around north of Quebec. And then as the ice began to melt, the land began to change and other hardwood plants and the forest came into being. One important thing for archaeologists in findings in Virginia and Maryland, during the Ice Age, the world's oceans were 400 feet lower than they are today. And they are actually finding now remains of Indian native sites that are 20 miles off the coast or along the Chesapeake Bay shoreline. And I'll have a little bit more to say. Well, the Chesapeake Bay did not exist at the end of the Ice Age. It was simply the Susquehanna River Valley. So people were living there, but as the ice melted, they had to move to higher ground. And this wasn't, you know, a 1,000-year kind of thing. It was like almost from generation to generation, they had to keep moving to higher ground and moving further and further inland. Their idea, their concept of the forest was a gift from the great creator. The great creator gave them everything they needed to survive in the forest. Their homes, their clothes, their foods, everything. A colonial writer said a squirrel could climb a tree on the Atlantic coastline and jump from tree to the Mississippi River and never touch the ground. It was vast. But the important thing here is that as the water rose and the people had to move their villages, they encroached upon other people. And if you are a group of, say, a small group of 300 people, there is a certain geographic area of that vast forest that you have to provide homes and firewood and food and clothing and all the rest. And when you have to move because of rising water, literally, then you are encroaching upon some other group's geographic area, which created infighting. Um, Nevertheless, the movement was probably from in Virginia. That coastline was 45 miles out in the ocean today.
Mm.
So they just kept moving to higher and higher ground. There are over 100 sites along the Outer Banks, or not the Outer Banks, the Chesapeake Bay area that have been located that represents this kind of movement. Potomac River, by the way, was only formed 10,000 years ago, only 10,000 years ago. But again, when we think of where were these people living and we look at the Potomac River today, well, a lot of those sites might have been washed away by the river, or they might be under the river. So there are sort of two groups then at about 6,000 years ago. There are those who have always been here that represent perhaps those that go back to 18,000 years ago. And then there are those that have intruded in a migrating population, perhaps from the coastline. And as they meet and clash, their cultures change, and there's infighting. The people here on Clover Hill were very different than the people that you would have seen if you had been at Jamestown, the Powhatan people. There's a lot that has been written about the Powhatan people by early colonists. Some of it was pure rubbish. Some of the most popular sketches of the Powhatan people contain native people with like lion's tails or huge claws for toenails. They're naked. But one thing you might notice as you look at the drawings is they have cloth. They have cloth. They're like robes that they're wearing. The people that probably lived here in the Clover Hill area were very much different, but we don't know a lot about them because it wasn't the Clover Hill area, the Piedmont of Virginia wasn't settled until the beginning of the 1700s. But we do know from archaeological digs around Blacksburg that the people probably lived in round igloo-shaped homes. They were 200-300 people to a grouping, stockaded, so they had some concern for enemies or intruders. They had diets that were fish and small game and plant foods. They did have this belief in the great creator, also the great mystery, which I find very intriguing because many of these people, when they just couldn't understand what the creator had given them, maybe a hurricane, why did you bring this hurricane on us and destroy everything we got? Well, that's the great mystery. We can't understand it. It's not possible for humans to understand the great mystery. So that was very different from Powhatan with long houses and stockades. And now most people think too that the interaction with Europeans started at, say, Jamestown or Plymouth. I can remember thinking, wait a minute, these people landed at Plymouth Rock, and this Indian walks out of the woods and starts talking to them in perfect King's English. How could that be? Well, it turns out that it was a part of the exploration of this new land. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So did the Brits and the Portuguese and the French and the Dutch. And by 1525, there was already a map or maps that had been drawn of the Caribbean, Florida, and the entire Atlantic coast up to the St. Lawrence Seaway. By 1550, archaeological digs in the Susquehanna River Valley revealed pieces of Dutch-made rifles. So the Dutch were probably trading guns, pots, metal pieces of things for furs, which they took back to Europe and introduced the whole concept of the beaver and deer trade with Europeans for things like top hats and saddles and gloves and so forth. That introduced a period in that people in this area would have been involved in, the Beaver Wars, which is almost never talked about in history classes. Began in the 1630s up in Massachusetts when the Mohawks started selling beaver pelts to Europeans. And there was just a ravenous demand for beaver pelts and deer pelts. And the Iroquois worked their way down to a Point of Rocks and traded pelts there. There was a native village at where we see Georgetown today, Anacostia as well, that were wrapped up in the Beaver Wars. The important thing here, though, is that at almost every contact with Europeans in this 1500s period, there was just incredible disease. De Soto's people in Florida wrote of trading or giving them trinkets to the local people. 2 weeks later, coming to a village where every man, woman, and child was dead, and they found the trinkets that they'd given them. Measles, mumps, smallpox, absolutely ravenous. Maybe half of the Cherokee Nation wiped out. Some estimates of over 500 different groups and languages wiped out at just the initial contact with Europeans. So just a devastating side effect. I often thought if I were Powhatan, I had heard all of these stories growing up of these people that arrived in big canoes with big, tall, white wings and imposed upon his people this terrible disease. And the medicine people, the shamans, had no effect on it whatsoever. And Powhatan wakes up one morning, looks across the river, and there are 3 big canoes with white wings tied up at Jamestown. Do you think the Jamestown people got a very smiling welcome from the native people?
Yeah.
So then you get finally, after you get into the period of colonial domination and expansion, which for Clover Hill was kind of interesting. The period of 1600s, early 1700s, of course, is plantations, and you can go down the James River in Williamsburg and see all of that. The agricultural process was about 2 to 3 years to clear trees from that vast forest, and then 2 or 3 years of tobacco plantation, and then the ground was depleted. So they had to have people constantly working westward, clearing land, planting tobacco, and then clearing more land and planting more tobacco. So you look at the early maps of Virginia, and Virginia extends all the way to the Mississippi River. So it wasn't just a matter of dominating a market, it was dominating the land and changing the land such that native people could no longer inhabit the land. And then there was huge backlash also, where there were treaties that were formed with groups. You know, you would have another group that would go on the war path or invoke some kind of retribution, and all Native people then were the target of European response to it.
Hmm.
So finally, Scots, Irish, and Germans, people with trades and farmers started moving into the Piedmont in the early 1700s. Thoroughfare Gap out here along 66 was one of the gateways to the West, along with Rockfish Gap. But by the time of the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1761, there weren't many organized groups left in Virginia. They had to pick, am I going to fight with the French? Am I going to fight with the British? Or am I going to try to stay neutral? One of the great travesties of that war that set the stage for the American Revolution was that some of the groups that fought with the British did so thinking that they were going to be given protected land, i.e. a reservation in the Ohio Valley. And when the war was over, the Brits said, no, we don't deal with heathens. So when the American Revolution came around, many of those tribes that had fought with the British fought with the colonists in this particular area. By the time of the American Revolution, though, there were almost no organized groups or tribes west of what we know of I-95 today. They had moved on west, been forced west, they'd been killed by diseases, they had been integrated by other tribes. The Meskwaki people will go even further than that. The Meskwaki people are out in Iowa, and they claim that they left the East Coast 1,000 years before white men. Now, I've never seen a Meskwaki calendar, but that's just an example of a culture that picked up the left. And the result was that when you, after the 1700s, 1800s, and you look to the plains, you see vestiges of beadwork and crafts and stuff that look like they're from the East Coast or from the Ohio Valley, and it's all a part of that movement. We talked a little bit about what Clover Hill might have looked like do you have any questions?
So and for folks that are watching, Clover Hill is one of the recent names of the land that Grace is on. It's the name of the farm that was here, which was given for Grace Church to be built on it. And so I remember you saying that we don't have much record of the specific tribe that might have been here, but you've got some good guesses. Is that right?
Yeah, the tribe that was in this area were called the Manahoac people, the peaceful ones. They were not an aggressive group. We know they did meet with the Iroquois people at Point of Rocks to trade beaver hides. There are no records, though, of any villages or sites that could be pointed to directly as Manahoac sites. But we do know that there are some diary entries and journal entries of early explorers that suggest that perhaps the Manahoac people were integrated into the culture of the Monacan people, who are still out around Luray. And then there would also be the possibility of whoever the people were that were down around Blacksburg. Mm-hmm. Definitely not with the Upper Mattaponi Pamunkey people. They were longtime enemies.
So when you do all of this research, I love that your fascination with not only the culture and geography, but also with the religious understandings and spirituality as well. When you think about all of this as a Christian, particularly on, in this day, which is, like I said, a holiday in transition between Columbus Day and Indigenous Persons Day, or as we approach the season of Thanksgiving, which is this kind of legendary meeting of white and indigenous cultures, and as if they're kind of one big happy family. You've had pretty clear eyes about the history. I wonder kind of what your takeaways are, particularly as a Christian. What's because we are people of God in Christ, what's our approach to the history or our understanding of this truth about the land that we're on right
now? As much concern and trepidation today as a Christian as well as an American. The U.S. expects all nations to uphold their treaties. By some counts, there are over 750 treaties that have been made with native populations, and only a couple of them have been honored. One is right here in Virginia with the Pamunkey Upper Mattaponi people. They have been on that land since 1642. It was a set aside and treaty with the Crown, not the United States. The other was the Seminole people. So if the United States expects other nations to uphold the treaties, then let's look inward and uphold our treaties with our own people. And the responsibility for that is national. It's not just for those states that have significant populations of native people, like say Oklahoma. It's a responsibility of everybody. Those are federal treaties. They're federal grants. They are federal things. And on this day and for Thanksgiving, the first people were just that. They were here prior to Columbus landing. One of my favorite T-shirts at National Museum of the American Indian says, the native people discovered Columbus. Our land was and is their land. And their first responsibility in looking at civil rights is to address their needs. And in doing so, I think there is an opportunity here for a learning experience. If we can adequately address the medical, legal, physical needs of our native people today, then how we deal with other ethnic issues will fall in place. But these are the first people. Thousands, tens of thousands of years before anybody else came here. And the last thing, as a Christian, I think there are a lot of similarities between what we believe as Christians and some of these native groups in the areas. They believed in a creator. They believed that the forest was a gift to humankind, just as in Genesis, where humans are given control over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. And we've got to do a better job. Did that incoming phone call just blow me off the air?
It's okay. We're still on the air. You're good. You were saying that there's similarities in the spirituality and the understanding of a great creator.
Yeah. So the forests were a gift from the Creator, and to humankind, just as in Genesis. And we've got to do a better job of taking care of that physical world as we know it today. You can call it environmental concerns, you can call it civil rights, you can call it human rights. It's all a gift from the Creator.
Yeah. What I hear you reflecting on there is there's a tone of confession that you use, of confessing the truth, and then there's opportunities for repentance or reparation, and in the casting of it all as kind of under the watch of a generous creator. There's an understanding that we're all under grace and dependent on grace, the gifts of this great creator. And so it's in the context of appealing to that giver of gifts that we depend for the confession to be forgiven and the reparation or repentance to happen. So I really appreciate the opportunity to reflect in that way. And I'll take the chance to thank you for your research and to thank God for the gift of this land that we're on, to confess that we acknowledge that the land is not ours, that it has been inhabited by others. Ultimately, this land is God's land, but that we are thankful for all people who God has given the lands to, and we ask God to help us in our ability to be good stewards of the land and good stewards of our neighbors, to try to care for one another and offer people the kind of dignity and respect and honor that they're due, particularly Indigenous peoples, First Peoples, and ultimately to thank God for the grace so that sin can be forgiven and repentance can happen, and just ask God for the grace to help it be true in our own lives and our own conduct. I'm really thankful for you, Denny, for your willingness to do this research and this work and share it with us. And I'm at the church right now. Not everybody can be, but it's only raining very lightly. So I think I might just take a minute to take a little walk and to reflect on what you've shared and think about this land and thank God for the gift of being allowed to be here and for the knowledge of the truth of what's been here before. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to doing it again. I know that this is not the only area of expertise that you have, that we could talk Revolutionary War, we could talk Civil War, we could talk World Wars, we could talk about a lot of history. So we'll return again and hear from you, but thank you for offering yourself for this time.
Thank you.
I hope everybody has a good day and a good holiday today, and encourage you to take a chance in prayer or reflection about what we've covered today and about this great creator made known to us in Jesus Christ. Goodbye.
Bye.